Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on the intersection of alternative proteins and climate change, land use, and biodiversity. My name is Sarah Gibbens, and I am an environment journalist for National Geographic, and I will be moderating today's panel. In my reporting at Nat Geo, I've seen the toll climate change can have on extreme weather, people, and ecosystems, and agriculture is an essential part of that conversation. For a little background information, just this month, a study published in the journal Nature found food production is responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions associated, and meat is associated with twice as many emissions as plant-based food production. Food production also occupies about half the planet's habitable surface. To limit global warming, scientists say many of us will need to reduce the amount of meat in our diets. In today's panel discussion, we'll explore how alternative proteins can help reduce emissions from food production while also freeing up land for climate mitigation strategies and reducing the threat to biodiversity. I'll now quickly review the agenda for this session before introducing our panelists. All right, as you can see, we are breezing through bullet number 1. We'll have our panel discussion and then 10 minutes for an audience Q&A. And then closing remarks. All right, some participation guidelines: be present and engaged, speak courteously with others, and participate actively in the chat, which I will be actively monitoring. All right, now I will introduce our panelists. First, we have Avery Cohn. Avery Cohn leads food and agriculture activities at ClimateWorks, as well as the Healthy Diets, Healthy Planet workstream of the Climate and Land Use Alliance, a grant-making strategy promoting a future for proteins consistent with climate and development goals. Avery joined ClimateWorks in 2019, following over 15 years of research and policy work on a food system compatible with a livable climate. During that period, Avery served as a professor at Tufts University, where he retains an affiliation, advised international organizations, and held additional roles at Stanford, Brown, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Avery holds a bachelor's from the University of California, Davis, a master's from the Yale School of Forestry, and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Stephanie Feldstein. Stephanie is the Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she heads a national program that addresses the connection between human population growth, overconsumption, and the wildlife extinction crisis. She created the innovative Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign to promote diets that are healthy for people and the planet. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and has more than 15 years of experience in advocacy, outreach, and communications, with a focus on animals and the environment. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, NPR, Salon, The Guardian, and more. And she is the author of The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World. Last, we have Gus Guadagnini. Gus serves as the managing director of the Good Food Institute in Brazil. Gus is one of the most active advocates for the sector, which has led him to lecture at several major universities, companies, innovation centers, and projects like TEDx. He has also the opportunity to collaborate with media outlets through interviews, as well as comments for Fantástico, Globo News, Estadão, Exame, UOL, Terra, and others. In 2020, Gus was appointed by GQ magazine as one of the Brazilians on the list of 25 names that can save the world. Okay, I will now begin with the questions for our panelists. I'll be asking each panelist to give a brief background on their work. I'll start with Avery. Avery, can you provide a quick summary of the biggest opportunities for alternative proteins to address the climate crisis?
Sure. Thanks so much to the Good Food Institute for the chance to speak today, and thank you to Sarah and the fellow panelists for having the chance to be part of this great conversation. So At the ClimateWorks Foundation, where I work, we're a philanthropic organization on a mission to end the climate crisis by stopping emissions in their tracks and then taking them negative. And as you all will know, we've got our work cut out for us there. We're already about 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels today. And we're aiming to stabilize the climate at just 1.5 C of warming by 2050. So that leaves for us a tiny remaining carbon budget that we really need to spend delivering inclusive growth that also doesn't harm our nature and our biodiversity or other natural resources. As you'll know, this is mainly a problem about decarbonizing energy and reducing emissions from industry. We've got to end the use of fossil fuels in producing electricity. We need to scale renewables in their place. We need to green industry like steel and cement. Got to electrify everything to crater demand for all of those nasty emissions from fossil fuels. We're beginning to make real progress in those regards. You will have seen the announcement yesterday about President Xi in China ending financing to overseas coal plants. Huge, and it's indicative of the kind of progress we're seeing across the board in energy. But we're behind on food and farming. And as Sarah mentioned, food and farming, they cause over a third of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And at ClimateWorks, we're signed on to a vision statement that says that we want to deliver a third of all emissions reductions or mitigation needed by 2050 from the food system. To do this, we're going to have to change everything about food. What we produce, where we produce it, how we produce it and consume it, and who benefits from food. We're going to need to make sure that the vast majority of foods that are produced and consumed are healthy and sustainable. We're going to need to repurpose something like a third of all of that large area of land that Sarah mentioned that's used for agriculture, so that it's either used more productively for agricultural and other purposes or rewilded. We're going to need to farm in the right ways too. And at ClimateWorks, we believe that diversifying the protein system is really at the heart of these challenges. And within that, there needs to be a role for both traditional forms of diversifying protein like lentils and pulses, and innovative alternatives like many of us have been discussing today in the conference. Done well, we can provide, we believe, more than half of all of the mitigation needed from food from diversifying protein, while also sparing land for nature and other productive uses, being able to use some of that land to remove carbon, which we're going to need to do after we go beyond that 1.5 degree C mark. And we need to make sure, and we can, use this additional land to create jobs and create trillions in both business value and avoided costs of meeting our climate targets. To give a sense of the potential, one recent study which we at ClimateWorks backed and which was released this week together with a couple of branches of the UK government, called the Global Innovation Needs Assessment for Net Zero, finds that diversifying protein would be the single most valuable source of innovation for net zero from the food system. And it's not even close. $5.5 trillion cheaper to reach the 1.5 degrees C target if we innovate to diversify protein versus if we fail to innovate to diversify protein. So actually the total value of diversifying protein in all the ways we know how is even bigger than that $5.5 trillion number. Really, really big. So how do we do it? We've talked about a lot of it today, but just as a reminder, we're going to need to enable these innovations by continuing to crowd in private investment with public incentives, leveling the regulatory playing field, repurposing policies, including, for example, that $1 trillion a year in agricultural subsidies, many of which are harmful to the environment and our climate goals. A study produced a week and a half ago now found that 90% of those subsidies really aren't aligned with our climate targets. And we're going to need to greatly improve how we do that. We need to build political space for climate action of all sorts and make our agenda on transforming food with protein at the heart a part of that. We need to ratchet up government commitments, and we also need to put diversifying protein at the heart of voluntary and regulatory efforts to transition those corporations that shape food to align their activities with the 1.5 degrees C future. Thanks.
Thanks, Avery. Stephanie, next question for you. Can you provide an overview of the connection between protecting biodiversity and alternative proteins?
Of course. Thanks to Good Food Institute for this conference. I'm really excited about this discussion that we're going to be having here. And it's really hard to overstate the urgency of reducing the impact of our food system on biodiversity. We are in the middle of an extinction crisis. It's predicted that as many as 1 million wild plant and animal species could go extinct in the coming decades if immediate action isn't taken to reduce threats to biodiversity. And the number one threat to biodiversity is animal agriculture, because it's the leading cause of habitat loss worldwide. I mean, doesn't matter what other protections we have in place for wildlife, if they don't have anywhere to go, then there's no way for them to thrive or recover. And similarly, as Avery talked about, it's a huge impact on the climate as well. And we've seen studies that have shown that even if we take those necessary steps of other sectors, the energy sector, the transportation sector, all going climate neutral, we can't reduce emissions enough to avoid catastrophic climate change without reducing livestock production, especially in high consuming countries that overproduce meat and dairy. Animal agriculture, it's really a leading cause of pretty much every pressure on biodiversity, not just habitat loss and climate change, but also water extraction, pollution, pesticide use, you name it. So we urgently need to shift diets as a key part of stopping the extinction crisis. And Avery covered a lot of ground on exactly what that can look like on the, in terms of all of the different ways that we need to approach this from different policy levels and funding levels and that sort of thing. I mean, of course, this is all easier said than done. We're talking about nothing short of transforming our food system, how it's funded, what we eat, how we think about food. We need to change policies and production systems to really support those lower impact foods. But I also want to emphasize that none of that can happen if we don't also change mindsets, menus, and eating habits. I mean, when it comes to food production, what's being produced is very closely tied to what people are actually willing to eat, right? There's a close tie with the market. And that's really where we see a lot of promise where alternative proteins come in, because it could take a long time to change eating habits. And the reality is that we're far off from everybody having the ability or frankly, the inclination to regularly choose homemade dishes of organic, local vegetables and whole plant proteins over fast and familiar meat-centered dishes. And unfortunately, the extinction crisis hasn't proven to be a strong motivator for change in that case. Although we have seen polls that have shown that concern about the climate crisis is becoming an increasing factor in why people have changed their dietary choices. I will also add that there are some concerns in the environmental movement about alternative proteins being part of the same industrialized food system that's harming wildlife as livestock production. But we at the Center for Biological Diversity, we recognize that alternative proteins demand really just a fraction of the inputs of what goes into creating conventional meat and dairy. So while we continue to work to change that industrial system, we don't have the time to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we need these solutions and innovations that are immediately available and widely embraced that can rapidly ease the pressure of our food system on biodiversity. And we really see alternative proteins as a way that can provide some of those solutions.
Thank you, Stephanie. Gus, the next question is for you. Can you share a summary of the work that Gfi Brazil is doing specifically around conserving biodiversity?
Of course. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Stephanie and Avery, for your comments so far. So in Brazil, we think that our biodiversity is a key element in how the country can add value to the whole alternative protein sector. We are the home of the largest biodiversity in the world, which includes plants and animals. The scientific potential of this biodiversity is immense. It can worth billions of dollars. And we are still beginning to figure out all the possible applications of these technologies that can emerge from this kind of study. We have two different focuses here in Brazil regarding this subject. The first is to decrease the dependency on imported products in the alternative protein industry. Brazil is a poor country, and the price points of technologies developed in other places may never be right for our country. We are still importing pea protein while being one of the largest crop producers in the world. So that's why GFI supports research around, for example, Brazilian beans and Brazilian cashews. So we can learn how to use the local plants and plant-based foods and make products more affordable, tasty, and less dependable on external factors like currency. And besides using the local crops, we have an effort to study more about the biodiversity of our biomes. Gfi got support from Climate and Land Use Alliance to create a research grant to support studies about the plants from the Amazon and Cerrado, two of the most important biomes of the world. This is an incredible potential to develop new technologies if we consider all plants available in those biomes. I will finish by saying that this kind of initiative adds a second layer of impacts to our industry. We already have all the impacts of replacing animal products, but now we can replace them by using native crops and plants, which will create positive social impact and also make our industry an important factor to create an economy based on the standing forest. We can keep the forests alive, support local producing communities, and support an agriculture that is not based on monoculture. Conserving the biodiversity is one of the most important agendas that will emerge from the alternative protein sector. And this is probably our number one focus in Brazil right now.
Thank you, Gus. The next question is for any and all of the panelists who may want to answer. Explain where or what locations might have the most meaningful impact from switching from traditional agriculture to alternative proteins.
I'm happy to jump in on that. The cheap answer would be everywhere, of course, since animal agriculture is putting pressure on all corners of the planet, whether we're looking at the fires set in biodiverse regions like the Amazon to clear the rainforest for feed crops and pasture, or the introduction of factory farms in parts of the world that had previously relied only on smaller scale production. But I have to really highlight the impact of shifting production in the United States, where we're among the highest meat consumers in the world, and vast parts of our country have been converted into monoculture crops drenched in pesticides just to feed livestock. It's really turned what was once these biodiverse ecosystems into wastelands. And since it takes as much as 89 times the amount of crops to produce 1 pound of beef as it does 1 pound of plant-based meat, I mean, shifting production could have a huge impact in terms of displacing that industrial crop system, protecting wildlife, and giving us the opportunity to start to rewild some of those native grasslands and prairies and wetlands.
If I can, I agree with Stephanie. And I believe that America is very important in this. So first, I believe that any location that produces animal products, especially the ones which enrich biodiversity, are important for this conversation. But if you want me to guess, I would say that Latin America will also have a relevant role in the creation of these new ingredients that are environmentally good and socially fair. We have the potential of feeding the whole world with these new technologies. The region here is already a strong food producer, is a strong food exporter, and has a tradition in scientific research in this area, while also being home to a very rich biodiversity. So I think we have all the elements in Latin America to be a very important part of this equation.
Okay, Gus, the next question I have is for you. The Brazilian Amazon is an example of where some of this biodiversity loss is happening at the expense or for the production of beef cattle. I'm wondering, if I eat an Impossible Burger in the US, or if an individual chooses an alternative protein, will that make a meaningful impact, or what sort of impact would you expect to see? How can I make a difference, essentially?
Perfect. So yes, today data shows that almost 80% of the Amazon deforestation is caused by animal agriculture. And Brazil is very strong on exports. So this meat that is being produced in the Amazon region is actually being exported to the whole world. The global demand for meat is a huge part of this problem. In my honest opinion, it's almost impossible to eat meat without collaborating with deforestation and the destruction of the most important biomes of the world. and is independent of where you are in the world. If you eat meat, you are contributing to these impacts. So in my opinion, shifting consumption for alternative protein will decrease the pressure to open new livestock farms while creating a new economy that can be based on local products, produced without harming the environment, and while creating a positive social impact. For this to happen, we as the industry, we need to make a choice in this direction, you know? So we need to invest in science and technology to develop more food ingredients with the characteristics that we want, and make business decisions to support the growth of this new biodiversity-based ingredient industry. I also think that it won't happen naturally. So also as the alternative protein industry, we need to choose to invest in this, and we need to focus in this area. But yes, you can certainly have a lot of impact just by changing your food habits.
Thank you. Avery, this I think has been touched on a little bit already, but I'm wondering if there are specific places or regions around the world that should think about the climate impact of protein production and potentially shift their practices.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And it's true, both Stephanie and Gus spoke to this already, and I agree very much with what they said. Let me try to elaborate a little, though. I think of this as a problem where we need to tunnel from the supply side and the demand side to meet the middle and make the market for alternative protein. And there's a case to be made for creating the demand in the places where people are willing to pay for it, and also where their consumption of protein and per capita, and also the type of protein per capita is misaligned with planetary boundaries. So that we're talking about rich countries and we're talking about rich people in major cities all over the world. This is the place where we need to create markets for our alternative proteins. And at the same time, on the supply side, it's a issue of opportunity. We can produce the feedstocks for plant-based alternative proteins anywhere. We've seen that places like major economies like the US, and also countries that choose to invest like Israel and Singapore are leading in developing technologies for alternative protein. And it's really just a matter of getting going. And when we go, doing it in ways that are locally appropriate, like Gus talked about, making use of local talent, making use of local crops and technologies. This is a really big problem. It's not a one-size-fits-all problem, and we can do it anywhere where there's the initiative to put a little effort into building an innovative new way of creating value from food and agriculture.
Thank you. The next question is for any and all of the panelists who would like to answer. In my own reporting, I've spoken to ranchers out west who say that the way that they raise cattle is in fact sustainable. And they often mention practices like regenerative agriculture. Is there a space for them in a future where alternative proteins are promoted as a more sustainable alternative to traditional meat?
So this is a really big topic that we deal with a lot, because there are certainly better and worse ways to raise cattle, but no form of beef production is sustainable at current levels. I mean, we need drastic reductions in beef, as much as 90%, to really meet climate goals and ease pressure on the land and wildlife. And once that reduction happens, I certainly hope that remaining beef production is happening by people who are concerned about biodiversity and it's not being produced in feedlots. And in fact, the people who are trying to implement best practices, it's not even possible until our overall scale of this industry is really reduced. But right now, the problem with claims about sustainable beef and regenerative grazing is we're seeing a lot of oversold statements, a lot of unsubstantiated claims, and no metrics about exactly how they're encouraging biodiversity. And it's interesting, that you mentioned ranchers in the West in particular, because oftentimes that's the worst place to be raising cattle, because it's so arid out there and it requires so much more water and much larger grazing ranges that really impact wildlife. So, I mean, cattle can be part of the world alongside alt proteins, but a much smaller part. And we need to be realistic about the fact that cows can't save the planet, but they can do a lot less harm if there are a lot fewer of them and some really clearly defined standards for sustainability.
I'd like to come in on this one. I have a slightly different perspective than Stephanie, although I agree with a lot of the points that she said. I'll try to lay out where the similarities and differences are. So first, when we look at the math of fitting the food system's emissions into the carbon budget we've got, it is very much the case, like Stephanie's saying, that we're using far too much land for agriculture today. And the vast majority of agricultural land that we use goes to livestock in general, both for extensive livestock, like cattle that are raised on rangelands, and then also for the feed crops that are used to feed other animals. We absolutely know that we can and must reduce the area of land that we devote to animal agriculture. But then I think there are debates to be had about just how much of a reduction we need. And it looks to me like a really large area of land that is devoted to animal agriculture and extensive rangeland cannot easily be used well for other productive purposes. Some of it can be rewilded. And then there is a large area of rangeland that can be used for productive purposes and should be. I've seen one analysis that suggests that if we were to repurpose something like a third of all global rangeland to either be rewilded or used for productive purposes, that would put us well on our way to meeting at least the carbon budget when it comes to food and agriculture. There are other issues for biodiversity, and the proof is in the pudding in terms of, do we know how to manage rangeland sufficiently sustainably? But the answer is, we know a lot and we need to learn more. So my take is there's a role for regeneratively ranched lands in the future where we're meeting our carbon budget. We also, like Stephanie's saying, need to reduce greatly our beef consumption per capita and repurpose a lot of those lands for more productive uses like cropland, integrated crop and livestock systems, and also to nature for rewilding. And I think that thinking about all these things together is important. And then finally, I might add that part of the alternative protein economy of today is focused on plant-based production of alternative proteins. As I flagged in the chat, there's no reason why those plants cannot be cultivated regeneratively using regenerative practices. And indeed, what Gus is referring to is a part of that same story. So I think it's an all of the above approach in my view.
If I can just add something to this discussion, I agree, and also, of course, I work for alternative protein, but while alternative protein is expected to grow in market share for the years to come, it is very unlikely that we will replace the whole animal industry in the near future. So I think we need to do both, support the growth of alternative proteins, but also support a regulation to create better practices in the animal industry, practices that are really sustainable and not only greenwashing propaganda. I believe that discussing these parameters to produce more sustainable meat is an important part of the food system shift, since animal meat will continue to exist, or at least in the next decades. The lack of regulation around this creates a space for poor practices to be announced as relevant impacts when they are not. So I think animal production has to evolve as the world changes and this discussion happens.
Thank you all. Stephanie, my next question for you is a hypothetical. Let's say, as market analysts predict, that people start eating more alternative proteins and more land is made available as a result. How should that land be put to use to best encourage biodiversity?
I really think it'll be a mix. Monoculture feed crops should definitely be converted to more diversified, regionally appropriate crops. Transition to regenerative organic crop production that would include practices that support biodiversity, things like cover crops and pollinator buffers and those sort of things. And while we're talking about kind of the ideal world and my wish list, I'd also like to see that land moved out of the hands of multinational agribusinesses and back into more locally owned smaller farms and co-ops to really help make that happen and bring in that regional knowledge and that care for biodiversity in the land. But we won't need all of that land, even though we're talking about crops that may be lower yield once all these practices are in place. It's still so much more efficient to grow crops to feed people than animals. And especially if as part of this transition, we're also addressing food waste and an inequitable distribution. So part of achieving this ideal just transition, this just sustainable food system, should be to end the overproduction of food. And that would free up additional land that could be rewilded. And it should go without saying that there's no land that currently is being used for livestock production that should be converted into new cropland. So in other words, places like public lands and national forests where cattle are currently allowed to graze should be left alone for those ecosystems to recover. And that's also where the idea of rewilding is a little bit of a misnomer, and talking about what lands might be productive and what not, because there already are wildlife living there. There already is a lot of biodiversity in these areas that are currently threatened by cattle, and just the removal of livestock from those areas would have huge benefits without any other interventions from people.
Thank you. Gus, this next question is for you. Looking at some of the supply chains involved in producing alternative proteins, how can we make sure that an alternative burger, for example, isn't using, say, Brazilian soy or something else that might also be a threat to biodiversity?
Well, this debate is also happening in the chat from Julia's questioning here, and I think it's a very important point to consider. First, we need to consider that most of the soy produced in the world is there to feed the animals. In Brazil, studies say that is up to 80%. So there is no chance that the plant-based industry will create a demand for monoculture even near to the one that exists today because of the cattle production. Shifting from animal products to plant-based ones will always be good for biodiversity, no matter the ingredients that are being used. That said, we can't ignore the huge opportunity around investing in new technologies that can be produced by small farms and communities that live close to forests and other biodiversity-rich locations. As I mentioned before, it is the second layer of impact. We can replace animal products and cause all the impacts of doing so, while also creating social impacts with small farmers and promoting environmental protection from the use of biodiversity materials. In my opinion, it's not a matter of consumer choice yet. We still need to invest much more in scientific research about this topic. I'm sure that we won't be able to change the food system in the whole world if all the technologies that are being developed in rich countries and based on plants that only exist there. If we want to be a global change, the whole world must be involved in the process, and we must receive investment to advance this industry across the whole world as well. So I would say there is still a step of scientific research before this can be just a consumer choice.
Thank you. My last question before the Q&A is for everyone. Say by 2030, 2050, or end of the century, what are your hopes for alternative proteins? Where would you like to see them be?
I would really love to see the promise of alternative proteins pay off by 2030 with some significant displacement of animal agriculture. I know it's really soon in the scheme of things, but we really can't just have endless growth of all protein sectors, which is a little bit of what we've been seeing in the short term. So within the next decade, I'd love to see less land, water, and energy going into protein production as animal agriculture is displaced. And looking toward the longer term, by 2050, I'd really love to see the alternative protein sector helping lead the way toward a more resilient food system with diversified ingredients, with the regionally appropriate ingredients that Gus and Avery have also talked about, regional production and shorter supply chains. And there's a whole host of best practices that I could talk about all day that promote biodiversity in terms of the alternative protein sector, really taking commitments to no deforestation or other land conversion, really paying attention to their water withdrawals and wastewater dumping and how that's affecting waterways and wildlife, the use of pesticides, the use of GMOs, and really looking to take a closer look at their supply chains and really, innovating there as well in terms of how they can best protect and promote biodiversity to really have a food system that is helping instead of harming or neutral toward biodiversity. I
agree with Stephanie, and I just want to add that the date of this change will be different considering the amount of investment that we can actually bring to the sector. So if we want to see this change, I think we have a very good theory of change, but if we want to see this change happening fast, we need to bring more investment to the sector, government money to support research, and also private money to invest in new business. I believe that the more we invest in this sector, and especially if we invest globally and in science that is inclusive for all, the more impact we will cause. Animal agriculture is one of the most critical contributors to the environmental problems, and the alternative protein industry can replace it, eliminate these impacts, and also create a new food production chain that is eco-friendly and socially fair. So we won't be able to reach our climate goals without changing the way we produce protein, but how fast this is going to happen depends on the amount of investment that we can bring to the sector.
These are pretty comprehensive answers. I don't have a whole lot to add except to say I have high hopes that we are well down the learning by cost curve so that these technologies are affordable for people and that they are also healthy and they are also tasty and they are also accessible. And as a result, they begin to displace a large portion of the foods that we consume today that are causing the harms that we can't sustain. And in order to get there, to Gus's point, they need to garner investment. They need to operate in a regulatory landscape where the playing field is flat. They need to have the opportunities to succeed. And I also agree that it makes sense for that to happen across many geographies so that we can have a race to the top on this critical part of transitioning the food system.
Thanks all. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask it in the chat box. But one that I have seen come up quite a bit so far is about communication and how to communicate the risk of biodiversity loss, climate change to people in a way that makes them perhaps more amenable to alternative proteins. What are some of the biggest communication challenges any of y'all might expect to see?
I want to take that one in a different direction and say, at ClimateWorks, as we think about the future of protein and its diversification, we don't put the responsibility at the doorstep of consumers to make the shift. We think it's the responsibility of businesses and governments to step up. And therefore, a big part of the communications challenge is exactly that, suggesting that businesses and governments have the agency to change our food system today and indeed have the responsibility to do it in order to deliver food that's aligned with climate targets, other sustainability goals, as well as other health and justice goals. And that is proceeding. We're starting to see a great deal more focus and work to require that corporations disclose their plans to transition to a low carbon future, to include a robust approach to food. Same with those who finance those corporations. And I think that's on the business side. On the government side, we've got a lot of work to do. When you look across the commitments that governments are making to tackle climate change, food isn't even always featured, let alone featured in a way sufficiently robust to accelerate the protein transition. And I think we really need to hold the feet to the fire of the businesses and governments accountable for shaping our global food system to change it for the better.
I couldn't agree more with Avery from this. We have a limited impact from communications. Food is very cultural and there's a lot of traditions involved, so people are not going to stop eating and they are not going to stop eating the things that they want to eat because they are part of their culture. So we need to change the foods that we are delivering to people and making possible to create better food choices because the industry invested in this and the government's invested in this. So I think one of the major problems of communications is actually thinking that we will be able to communicate this until you get the results. There is a different step, as Avery mentioned.
I agree with what both Avery and Gus have said. And just add, when it comes to biodiversity and the extinction crisis, unfortunately, there is not a good understanding at any level, from individual up to policymakers, about just how dire this situation is and just what the consequences will be for humanity. And unfortunately, since the Endangered Species Act was passed decades ago, which is a great law in the United States to protect wildlife, the discussion has been warped into creating a dichotomy between, business and profits and wildlife, and then sometimes even between, communities and protecting wildlife. And so that's really a narrative we need to break through. Interestingly enough, I think it's something that on a very surface level that the conversation about regenerative agriculture is starting to do. But again, like I mentioned earlier, the problem is right now that that's just really superficial. And so we really need to make sure that we add a more meaningful understanding of how regenerative agriculture can protect biodiversity and the benefits of that. And how to measure and have accountability there as well before that just gets kind of greenwashed into meaninglessness. But so we are starting to see it kind of peek its head up in these agriculture conversations. But unfortunately, right now, climate is still having more resonance at all levels than biodiversity.
Thanks, everyone. This next question is about making alternative proteins more equitable. We've all seen those news stories about a $20 chicken nugget in Singapore and other sort of expensive examples of alternative proteins. Is there a future where the global south or less developed countries have access to some of these alternative proteins? How can we make them more available to everyone?
If I can step in on this, I think there are two sides of this that are very important to consider. One is that the lack of foods that we have now, the food insecurity, is also caused by this animal agriculture. So when people start to eat less meat, they will positively impact the whole world just by changing their habits, because you have more land to plant crops and for people to eat from these plants that are growing in all the countries. That said, of course, we need to invest in the alternative protein sector in all countries. As I mentioned before, I think this is a very important part of the equation. So making sure that resources will be distributed in a way that can impact positively everyone. So we need to develop technologies that can be produced and eaten in Brazil and in Africa and in every poor country that exists based on the kind of crops and plants that are growing in these specific countries. But a lot of times these countries, they won't have the money to invest themselves and to create these technologies. And then we risk creating a new food system or a new industry that is not possible to spread to the whole world or to be implemented in the whole world. So I, again, point out that there is a very important element of scientific research, and this scientific research happening all around the world, not only in the rich countries.
I really appreciate Gus's response and this question, because it's so important that access to sustainable food and agriculture are not limited by income, geography, different backgrounds. That really is something that is available and accessible to everybody. And I think it's so important that the alternative protein sector recognizes and embraces this, because we want to make sure that the alternative protein sector doesn't wind up repeating the same mistakes as industrial agriculture in terms of its impacts on low and middle income countries, on communities of color, and other vulnerable and marginalized folks. So paying attention to this question and how we make these foods more accessible and affordable is, I think, a piece of that puzzle, really acknowledging the importance of food justice in this sector.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues' remarks. So important to remember that the benefits we get from the scaling up of alternative protein comes to those who produce it, those who consume it, and others who benefit from a food system in which there's far less demand for land and far less pressure on the climate and natural resources. This will drive down the health impacts. It'll drive down the environmental impacts. It'll make access to nutrition more affordable for people. All of those things are important. And I think we do have a tightrope to walk, in addition to what my colleagues have mentioned, on sort of, on the one hand, there is the benefits that everyone can accrue from this new economy, but on the other, it is costly at the outset, and those who consume alternative proteins at the outset are far more likely to be people who have the money to do it. And also that does align with, part of the way we think about kind of the responsibility for acting on climate and other environmental crises, where a lot of the problem has been caused by the production and overconsumption of resources in rich countries. And it's really important that those rich countries begin the process of shifting to the system we need to see moving forward.
Thank you. This next question points out that the demand for protein is expected to increase around the world. How can we avoid adding additional emissions and biodiversity loss by adding sort of another industry to the mix? How can we make proteins a more meaningful replacement rather than addition to our food system?
I think there's an important distinction here between the increase in protein that's happening in countries where it is needed for nutrition and and for health, and in countries like the United States where there is already an overproduction of protein happening. I think, as we mentioned earlier, the role of alternative proteins in this across the board is really that it's an opportunity to produce needed protein with using far fewer resources. And if that protein is able to take the place of conventional meat and dairy in countries where more nutrition is needed and where more protein is needed, that's great. And that's going to look a little bit different than how it has to happen in the United States, where we really need to scale back conventional meat and dairy production as we are scaling up these other more sustainable alternatives.
And I just want to add that, in my opinion, it's virtually impossible. Today, for each calorie that you get from meat, 10 calories were given to this animal during its life. So it is impossible to eat the calorie directly from plants and have this impact that we need to have to produce the animals. There are studies that show that we could be feeding 3 billion, maybe even more people, with just the land that is already being used in agriculture in the world. So once we stop eating animals, or once we decrease the consumption of animal products, we are certainly going to release a lot of land to be shifted back into forests or used in different kinds of production. And eating the calorie directly from plants or from cells that were cultivated will never have the same negative impact as the animal industry has.
Okay, thank you both. This next question says, what the current food production system has developed over the past century. Is it possible to use alternative proteins to rehaul our food production system in the next decade or two? And if so, how?
Yes, it's possible. And it's possible by getting them to price and taste parity and making them healthy and enabling all of that with all the things we talked about before. And it's going to have to be in this decade to win on climate. And in fact, when we at ClimateWorks think about the kinds of steps we think need to happen in order to solve the climate crisis, it's really only technologies like alternative protein that have the potential to scale and scale quickly that we think are going to be able to get us to the changes that we need at the pace that we need it.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to add on to that I don't think we have a choice but for it to happen. We can either choose for it to happen or it's going to happen for us as we see the impacts of climate change worsening. Even as we saw from the latest IPCC report, like there will be climate change, like it is here and it will continue. The question now is just how much can we mitigate the worst impacts of it? So I think we already will see changes there from how things are produced on the ground as it affects farmers and producers. And then also, I think we can look to, what happened in, last year with COVID-19 when meatpacking plants were shut down and it disrupted entire supply chains. And we'll see other types of crises having that same impact that will really force us to rethink these really long and really inefficient supply chains that we have, and how do we overhaul the food system so that we can actually keep getting food to people.
Great. Unfortunately, I have to cut you off, Gus, because we are at time. But thank you to all the panelists for making time to speak with us today. We're going to share a slide that has helpful resources for anyone who has any additional questions they want to look into. But with that, I thank you for attending and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.